You ever get that feeling when you're reading those epic stories, from the Bible? Like, there's got to be more to this story. Like David and Goliath. Awesome story, but did it really happen like that?
It's a real puzzle, isn't it? I mean, we've got these grand narratives from the Old Testament written down, what, centuries after the supposed events? Maybe even based on, like, stories passed down through generations. But how much of it is actual history? That's where archaeology comes in, I think, to help us sort it all out.
So it's kind of like a detective story, you're saying,
Hmm.
using both the Bible and the stuff they dug up to get to the truth.
Exactly. And sometimes what we find, well, what we find in the dirt actually challenges those traditional stories, the ones we thought we knew. For example, you might be surprised to learn that early archaeologists were so eager to confirm the biblical accounts. Sometimes they got a little creative, let's say, with their interpretations.
So they were kind of seeing what they wanted to see.
Yeah, you could say that. They'd find a big, impressive building from like the 10th century BC and automatically assume it was built by King Solomon. Didn't matter if the pottery styles, the ones found inside, were from a completely different time period.
Hold on. So they were basically saying, oh, look, a fancy building. Must be Solomon's. Even if the evidence didn't really add up. That seems like a pretty big leap.
It does, doesn't it? And it makes it that much harder to separate, well, the real story of the Kingdom of Israel from, well, wishful thinking. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a classic example of what some archaeologists call text-impeded archaeology, where the desire to match the Bible, well, sometimes it got in the way of a truly objective look at the evidence.
Okay, so to understand this whole thing, we need to step back and look at the world these folks were living in. We're talking about the late Bronze Age, right? Empires, trade routes, things seem pretty stable for a while at least.
Think Hittites in Anatolia, Mycenaeans in the Aegean, Egyptians with their fingers in everything from Canaan to, well, further afield. These were the big players,
And then, boom, the Bronze Age collapses.
Yeah.
Like that scene in a movie where everything just goes to chaos, empires crumble, people are on the move, and the whole world is in flux.
And right in the middle of all this, we get the first mention of Israel. Outside the Bible, I mean. It pops up on this inscription. It's called the Merneptah Stele, where this Egyptian pharaoh, he's boasting about all the folks he defeated around 1208 BC. He basically calls out Israel as one of them, but we don't even know for sure if he's talking about a specific place or a group of people.
So this inscription is basically like a shout out, but a really confusing one. Like, hey, Israel, you got beat. But who is Israel at this point? A city? A tribe? A bunch of nomads? It's a pretty big mystery.
It really is. And it's from this hazy period, this period of upheaval, that the story of the Kingdom of Israel, at least according to the traditional narrative, well, it begins to emerge. And at the center of that story is this supposed first king, King Saul.
Yeah, Saul. The Bible kind of paints him as a bit of a tragic figure, doesn't it? Like, he was trying his best, but just kept messing things up. Sort of a necessary stepping stone, I guess, to a greater king.
He's almost like the King Arthur of the Israelites, setting the stage for a more legendary successor. But when we look at the archaeology, there's no evidence of Saul himself or a unified kingdom in the 11th century BC. We see regional differences, various cultures doing their own thing, but nothing that really screams unified kingdom under King Saul.
So it's kind of like those Where's Waldo pictures, where you think you've spotted him, but it turns out to be some other guy with glasses and a striped shirt.
Exactly. No clear sign of Saul, just a lot of local variation going on, still figuring things out after the Bronze Age went kaput.
So if there's no Saul, where does the story really start to pick up?
Well, that's when we get to the big name, the one that echoes through history, King David.
Ah, David, the giant slayer, the unifier, the guy who made Jerusalem the place to be. That David.
That's the one. But just like with Saul, the archaeological evidence doesn't quite match, the grand biblical narrative. We don't have any direct evidence of David himself. But there's this one tantalizing clue that sparked endless debates. The Tel Dan Stela.
I'm all ears. What's so special about this stela?
Well, this inscription, it dates back to the 9th century BC. It actually mentions the House of David.
Wait, so there's something out there in the real world that actually refers to King David. Case closed, right?
Yeah.
He existed just like the Bible says.
Hold on. It's not quite that simple. The inscription, see, it's broken. And while it does mention the House of David, we don't know for sure what that means. It could refer to, a dynasty, a line of kings claiming descent from this, legendary David.
Okay, so like a royal family tree with David at the top.
Exactly. And this is where it gets tricky, it could also just be a place name. Think about how many towns have, like, Beth in their names. Bethlehem, Bethel, Beth Shemesh. House of David might just be referring to a town or a region,
Right.
not necessarily a king.
So like finding a document that mentions New York, but you don't know if it's talking about the city or the state, or maybe even some tiny village that existed centuries ago. It's a clue, but not the definitive proof that some might hope for.
You got it. And that same ambiguity, well, it hangs over David's son, the supposed king who took the kingdom to its peak, Solomon.
Solomon, the wise one, the builder of the first temple, the guy who supposedly had it all: wealth, wisdom, power. If any king left behind a mountain of archaeological evidence, it would be him, right?
You'd think so, right? I mean, if Solomon was this rock star king, the rock star king of the ancient world, you'd expect to find his hits all over the place. But here's the thing. There's basically no evidence of this grand Solomonic empire in the 10th century BC.
Hold up. Are you saying that all that stuff about Solomon's, incredible wealth, his massive building projects, his legendary wisdom, it might all be more fiction than fact?
Well, let's just say that the archaeological evidence doesn't exactly support the image of a powerful, unified kingdom under Solomon in the 10th century BC. No mentions in Egyptian records, which is odd for someone who was supposedly so powerful. And a lot of the grand structures that used to be attributed to him, well, it turns out they were built much later.
So it's like that moment when you realize the band's bio is full of hype, but you can't find any actual albums or concert footage. Makes you wonder what's really going on.
Right. It's a real head-scratcher for archaeologists and, well, biblical scholars, too. Was Solomon's reign as amazing as the Bible claims? Or is this a case of a story being embellished over time,
Maybe a story that got, bigger and better with each retelling,
Hmm.
especially considering what happens next.
And what happens next, well, is a dramatic split.
Yep.
A rift in the kingdom that leads to the emergence of two separate entities, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And here's where archaeology starts to offer a bit more clarity.
So it's like instead of one big happy family, we've got sibling rivalry and two separate households, each doing their own thing.
A very apt analogy, and one of the most fascinating pieces of evidence that sheds light on this period is, well, it's the Mesha Stela. And I'm not talking about a replica, this is the real deal.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What makes this particular stela so important?
Well, this stela, set up by this King Mesha of Moab around the 9th century BC, it's a game changer. It mentions Omri, the king of Israel, as a rival, and even name drops the Israelite god Yahweh.
Wait, so we've got a non-biblical source that actually mentions a king from the Bible, and confirms the existence of a powerful Israelite kingdom. Around the 9th century BC, I'm curious, does this stela completely change how we understand the early kingdom?
It definitely adds a new layer of complexity. It suggests that, well, the story of a unified kingdom under David and Solomon, at least as it's presented in the Bible, might need, well, some serious revision. But it also confirms that a powerful Israelite kingdom did exist, just maybe not in the way or at the time the traditional narrative suggests.
So it's like realizing that maybe your family's origin story isn't entirely accurate, but the core of your family history, well, it's still there. Just maybe shifted a bit on the timeline. Fascinating. But what was life like in these two separate kingdoms? Did they leave behind different traces?
That's a great question. And it leads us to some really intriguing archaeological discoveries. It's like focusing a blurry photo, The more we zoom in on these separate kingdoms, the clearer the picture becomes.
Okay, so let's dive into that. What can the archaeology tell us about these divided kingdoms and what happened to them in the end?
It really is like watching a family drama unfold, Two brothers, each vying for power, each trying to establish their own legacy. In the biblical account, we see this play out with the northern kingdom, which kept the name Israel, and the southern kingdom, which became known as Judah.
So it's not just a political split, it's a family feud with some serious consequences. What can archaeology tell us about how these two kingdoms, developed?
Well, remember how we talked about that lack of solid archaeological evidence for a unified kingdom under David and Solomon? I mean, things get much more interesting when we look at the divided kingdoms.
So it's like those old family photos where you can't quite make out everyone's faces until you zoom in and focus on smaller groups. Give us some examples. What kind of distinct traces did these kingdoms leave?
Let's start with the northern kingdom of Israel. Their capital was Samaria, a city built by King Omri, that same king mentioned on the Mesha Stela, remember? Archaeologists have found quite a bit of Omri's palace and the city walls, confirming that there was a powerful kingdom in the north during the 9th century BC.
So finally, some solid evidence that matches up with the biblical account. What was Samaria like?
Imagine a grand city, strategically placed, on a hilltop, with these impressive fortifications and a palace fit for a king. It was a real statement of power and a center of trade and culture.
It sounds almost like a scene out of Game of Thrones. A powerful kingdom, a fortified city, and probably a whole lot of intrigue going on behind those palace walls.
You're not wrong about that. And remember, this is a time when empires are collapsing and reforming all over the place. So building a stronghold like Samaria, well, it would have been essential for survival.
Kind of like building a castle in the middle of a hurricane. You need a solid foundation to, weather the storm.
But what about the southern kingdom of Judah? What were they up to while all this was happening in the north?
The southern kingdom, with its capital in Jerusalem, was also busy developing its own identity. Excavations in Jerusalem have uncovered layers of fortifications and palaces dating back to the 9th and 8th centuries BC, showing a period of significant growth.
Jerusalem. That city has, well, it has such a long and complex history. It must be amazing for archaeologists to dig down through those layers and uncover, pieces of its past.
It really is. And it's not just about the big structures. It's about the everyday objects, the pottery shards, the inscriptions that give us glimpses into the lives of ordinary people. We can learn about their diets, their religious practices, even their interactions with other cultures. So it's kind of like piecing together a giant jigsaw puzzle, using these little fragments to get a richer, more complete picture of what life was like back then.
Exactly. And one of the things that really stands out to me is the cultural dynamism of this period. Think about it. The Northern Kingdom, more open to, outside influences, they developed a distinct artistic style, evident in their pottery, their ivory carvings. The Southern Kingdom, more conservative, focused on preserving its religious traditions, they retained a closer connection to, well, to earlier Canaanite culture.
So it's like two branches of the same family tree, each evolving in its own way while still sharing some of those, well, deep-rooted similarities. But what was happening in the wider world while all this was going on, were these kingdoms isolated? Or were they caught up in the geopolitical drama of the time?
Oh, the ancient Near East was never a peaceful place. These kingdoms were surrounded by, well, powerful empires like the Assyrians, the Egyptians, always vying for control. The Israelite kings, they had to play this delicate game of diplomacy and military strategy just to survive.
Sounds like a high-stakes game of chess, with alliances shifting, betrayals waiting around every corner, and the constant threat of being, checkmated by a more powerful player. What does this tell us about the kings themselves? Were they really those larger-than-life figures that, that the Bible often portrays?
Well, the biblical accounts, especially when it comes to the kings of the divided monarchy, they're definitely written with, a particular point of view. Some kings are praised for their piety, and their adherence to religious law, while others are, well, condemned for their wickedness and idolatry.
So it's like reading a history book written by the winners, where certain figures are painted as heroes and others as villains, depending on who's telling the story. But what about the archaeology? Can IT help us separate the propaganda from the reality?
Absolutely. Archaeology can often offer a more, well, a more balanced perspective, and sometimes even a contradictory perspective. For example, King Ahab of Israel. He's often portrayed in the Bible as, well, a pretty bad dude. But the archaeology tells a different story. His palace in Samaria was incredibly lavish, showing his wealth and power. And he was a skilled diplomat, forging alliances with neighboring kingdoms, even with the Phoenicians, who brought, well, new religious ideas and practices to Israel.
So Ahab, the supposed villain, was also a savvy politician and a patron of the arts. It's a good reminder that history is rarely, black and white. What about the other kings? Any surprises there?
Well, take Hezekiah, the king of Judah. He's often celebrated for his, religious reforms and his defiance against the Assyrians. And the archaeology backs this up to some extent. Hezekiah strengthened Jerusalem's defenses and even built a sophisticated water system, the Siloam Tunnel, to make sure the city could withstand a siege.
Wow, talk about thinking ahead. He was like the ancient world's urban planner, preparing for the worst while, hoping for the best. It's amazing how archaeology can challenge our preconceived notions and add, layers of complexity to these historical figures.
It's a good reminder that even the most familiar biblical stories, well, they're often just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole world of intrigue, political maneuvering, and cultural exchange happening, beneath the surface. And it's through archaeology that we can start to unravel those hidden threads. and gain a deeper appreciation, I think, for the richness and diversity of ancient Israelite society.
It's like those archaeological digs where you start with a seemingly simple patch of dirt and end up uncovering a whole lost city. And speaking of lost cities, let's shift our focus to a particularly fascinating site, Tel Hesse.
Ah, Tallahassee. It's a site that offers a unique window into the lives of people who were living on the periphery of these powerful kingdoms. Remember how we talked about the tendency of early archaeologists to focus on the grand palaces and city walls? Well, Tallahassee tells a different story.
It's like turning our attention from the bustling city center to the quieter, more rural areas where we can learn about the lives of everyday people. What makes Tallahassee so special?
Well, Tallahassee, see, it wasn't a grand capital city. It was more of a rural settlement, maybe a pastoralist hub, but with connections to the copper mines over in Jordan and potentially even linked to those long-distance incense trade routes, the ones that stretched across the Arabian Peninsula.
So while kings are building palaces and waging wars, the people of Tallahassee are tending their flocks, mining copper, and trading goods, across vast distances. It paints a much more interconnected and economically vibrant world than we might imagine.
Exactly, and the archaeology at Tallahassee supports this. They've found storage jars, likely held imported goods, as well as evidence of metalworking and other craft activities. It's a reminder that even in a world dominated by, powerful kingdoms, ordinary people were living their lives, making a living, and contributing to the economic and cultural fabric of the region.
It's like realizing that even in a Hollywood blockbuster, it's the extras, the market vendors, the families going about their daily routines that make the story feel real. But let's not forget about the Philistines. Those enigmatic seafarers who carved out their own slice of power along the coast. What can you tell us about them?
The Philistines are fascinating. They were originally part of the Sea Peoples, those mysterious groups that migrated, across the Mediterranean, shaking things up and redrawing the political map. The Philistines settled along the southern coast of Canaan, building their own cities and engaging in, both conflict and trade with their neighbors.
So they were like the new kids on the block, bringing their own traditions and customs, but also adapting to their new environment. What kind of evidence do we have for Philistine culture?
Archaeologically, they stand out. They brought pottery styles and burial practices that were, different from their Canaanite neighbors. And they were skilled metal workers and warriors, often depicted in the Bible as, formidable adversaries.
It's like those historical reenactments where you can clearly see the difference in the armor,
Ah.
the weapons,
Mm.
the fighting styles between different groups. But did the Philistines over time blend in with the people around them?
That's a question. Well, it's a question archaeologists are still debating. Some evidence suggests that they adopted certain Canaanite customs while also influencing the culture around them. It's a classic example of, cultural fusion, where different groups interact, exchange ideas, and create something new.
It's a reminder that cultures are rarely static. They're constantly evolving, borrowing, and blending elements from those around them. But sadly, all good things must come to an end. And for both the Israelite kingdoms and the Philistine city-states, that end came at the hands of, a powerful empire from the east, the Assyrians.
The Assyrian Empire, it was a force to be reckoned with. They were masters of warfare, masters of administration, and their expansion across the Near East, it had a profound impact on the entire region. For the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the Assyrian threat was it was like a shadow looming over their political and economic lives.
It's like that feeling when you know a storm is coming,
Hmm.
that sense of unease and anticipation as you wait for the inevitable. How did the Assyrians ultimately bring about the downfall of these kingdoms?
The Assyrians they were ruthless and efficient conquerors. They had a strategy of divide and conquer, turning kingdoms against each other. And they were masters of siege warfare, capable of bringing down even the most, heavily fortified cities. The northern kingdom of Israel, it fell to the Assyrians in 722 BC. Its people scattered, its capital Samaria destroyed.
A classic tale, unfortunately, of a once powerful kingdom brought down by, a stronger adversary. But what about the southern kingdom? Did they fare any better against this Assyrian onslaught?
Judah, they managed to hold out a bit longer, but their fate was, it was ultimately sealed. In 701 BC, the Assyrian king, Sennacherib, he laid siege to Jerusalem. And while the city itself, it miraculously survived, the surrounding countryside was, it was devastated. This marked a turning point for Judah, a time of fear, uncertainty, and a profound sense of vulnerability.
It's like that moment when you realize that the walls you thought were impenetrable, well, they've been breached, and your world is forever changed. But in the midst of this turmoil, there's a glimmer of hope, a story of resilience and defiance that, well, that emerges from the archaeological record.
It's remarkable, how even facing the might of this Assyrian Empire, the people of Judah, they didn't just give up. They found ways to adapt, to innovate, to keep going.
It's that human spirit, right? We find a way even when things look bleak.
Exactly. And we see this in one of the most fascinating archaeological discoveries in Jerusalem, the Siloam Tunnel.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading about that. It's that incredible underground water system built by King Hezekiah, right?
That's the one. Picture this. The Assyrians are literally at the doorstep, threatening to cut off Jerusalem's water supply, which would basically mean game over. So what does Hezekiah do? He commissions the construction of this 1,750-foot-long tunnel, carved right through solid rock, to bring water from the Gihon Spring into the city.
That's incredible. It's like something straight out of, an adventure movie. A secret passage, a race against time, all to save the city.
And what makes it even more amazing is that we have this inscription, the Siloam inscription, that describes the whole construction project. It's like a first-hand account, carved into the very heart of Jerusalem.
They're like those time capsules,
Right.
the ones people bury, leaving messages for the future. Except this one is carved into the bedrock of the city itself.
The Siloam Tunnel is a real testament to human ingenuity and determination. It allowed Jerusalem to hold out against those sieges, ensuring its survival through a very turbulent period.
Really makes you think about what people can accomplish when they work together,
Yeah.
even when facing, seemingly impossible odds.
Absolutely. But the Assyrian conquest, it didn't just impact the physical landscape. It had a profound effect on the religious landscape of Judah as well. Many scholars believe that this period of crisis and upheaval, this is when the core narratives of the Old Testament, they began to take shape.
So this time of, turmoil and uncertainty actually became a time for reflection, a time to collect and preserve the stories and traditions that would define a people's identity.
Precisely. The destruction of the Northern Kingdom, the scattering of its people, the threat to Jerusalem itself, all of this contributed to a sense of urgency, a need to preserve their history and their faith. And it's in the writings of the prophets, the ones who lived through these times, folks like Isaiah, Jeremiah. That's where we see a real reckoning with the Assyrian threat and a call for spiritual renewal.
So out of the ashes of, destruction and exile, these powerful narratives emerged, shaping the very foundations of Judaism and having an impact on countless generations that followed.
It's a reminder that stories have power, especially in times of crisis. They can offer comfort, hope, and a sense of continuity when everything else feels like it's falling apart.
It makes you appreciate how those ancient stories, the ones passed down through centuries, they still resonate with us today.
And the story of the Kingdom of Israel, as we've seen, it's far more complex and nuanced than any simple narrative can capture. It's a story of ambition and conflict, of resilience and cultural exchange, of empires rising and falling, and of the enduring power of stories to shape how we understand the past.
It's been a real journey exploring this ancient world through the lens of both the Bible and, archaeology. What would you say is the most important thing we can take away from all this?
For me, it's the understanding that history isn't a fixed, unchanging story. It's a tapestry woven from many different threads, each with its own perspective, and interpretation. The more we learn, the more we realize that the past is, it's full of surprises, challenging us to rethink our assumptions and to embrace, the complexity of human experience.
It's a good reminder that the search for understanding is, it's an ongoing process, and that every new discovery, it has the potential to change how we see the past.
So as you delve deeper into the history of the Kingdom of Israel, or any historical period for that matter, keep an open mind, question everything, and be prepared to be amazed.
Well said. And if this deep dive has piqued your curiosity, be sure to check out the episode notes for links to, the articles, maps, and images we put together for you to explore further. Don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss out on, more fascinating journeys like this one. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.